Good evening, everyone. We're just going to wait to get started. A couple minutes. I don't think we're going to have a big group, but we'll wait a couple more minutes. I'm curious if someone could chat in maybe just in the chat, if you could put in that you can hear me, or even give me a reaction, like a thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Probably wait a couple minutes and then get started. Let's see. Just wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Thank you. So Bernadette, I'm probably gonna get started. Once we get started, it's up to you if you want to like turn off your screen. Don't worry about like having to stay on and stuff. Okay. So, okay, thank you everyone for joining us on our talk today, Navigating Change Together, a webinar for families transitioning through divorce. My name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I really am appreciative of the time that you've taken to sign into today's talk. So let's get started. Just a couple of acknowledgements. I'm going to say this is the fourth of 4 webinars that the Prime Care Family Health team has asked me to do, and so I've been very appreciative of their support. Thank you to Prime Care for giving me this opportunity to connect with the community at large. And I also want to thank Bernadette Comiskey, who's completing her doctorate in education and who actually is a clinician at our clinic as well. So she's kind enough to be here to support any chats or anything, in terms of the chat or Q&A. So thank you to Bernadette as well. As you've noticed, we're asking people to keep their cameras and microphones off. You'll notice that there's a chat and a Q&A at the top of the screen. The Q&A, I would ask you to sort of, put in any questions that you have. The chat, if any comments and we want to have a bit of a conversation at all, we can use the chat. I'm not sure how much that's going to be happening today, but I ask you to use those functions. I will try to have some time at the end to try to answer some questions. So what are we going to be talking about today? So we're going to talk a little bit about divorce, how it affects adults, how it affects children, some guidelines as to some things to consider as we're transitioning into divorce or separation. And then I'm going to try to propose to you some best case scenario situations. And I'm doing that using a framework called acceptance and commitment therapy. It's my main therapeutic approach. It's my philosophy as a therapist, and I structure a lot of my talks based on ACT. And so I'm going to use them and present it in a very brief way to try to guide the next part of the conversation, which is transitioning to mindful parenting and co-parenting in particular. We will then talk about some other considerations to consider, and then I'll give you some concrete strategies given that I imagine that you're going to be facing some challenging scenarios in this transition point. So in terms of who I am, my name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I am the Director of Child and Adolescent Services at Etobicoke Psychological Services. And I'm also, we also have a clinic in Vaughan called, sorry, I want to turn off this camera. Give me a sec. Brendan, is there a way for you to go to the camera at the top and just maybe toggle it off so that? I apologize.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, Dr. Ed, I'm not sure how to do that from here.
It doesn't let me. It doesn't let me usually. Yeah, give me a sec. I can do it. I think I can do it.
Okay.
Yeah, give me a sec. Yeah, here we go. Oh, I'm not sure how to do it. That's interesting. Anyways,
yeah,
it doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't give me an option. It doesn't matter. I'll continue. So I'm the Director of Child and Adolescent Services at Etobicoke Psychological Services and EPS Family Health. I'm a clinical and school psychologist, and I work with children of all ages, young adults, and parents. Two of my main areas of interest are parenting work and also giving talks and presentations and supervision. I supervise quite a few early career psychologists. One of the things that I'm going to stipulate, and you're going to hear me say this later, is our clinic actually doesn't do much work in terms of custody and access. If you are going through the process of sort of the separation and divorce, and you're looking for custody and access support, you'll hear me talk about that later, but that is something that you're going to want to find somebody who specializes in it, somebody who specializes in that topic, because most psychologists won't be able to do that work. And so you got to do a little bit of research, and I can support you in how to find somebody who does that type of work. But just that's something that we don't do as a clinic. Just wanted to clarify that. Couple of things I want to just state, and I've stated this throughout the 4 webinars that we've done for Prime Care. I'm not providing any direct psychological services. What that means is I won't be able to do specific cases or situations. The whole purpose of today is to provide information and resources, and offer a slightly way of approaching your relationship with your children and the co-parent in this scenario. My focus is on parents. I will mention some topics that can have their own presentations. You'll notice that actually one of the things that'll be interesting, and I should say, this talk will be made available through Prime Care. They will offer a link to this talk afterwards. And I also uploaded it onto my YouTube channel. So EPS Family Health, there's a YouTube channel. You will see all my webinars for free on there. You can just log on. One of the things that's interesting is the topics, even though they're distinct for webinars, there's a lot of overlap. And so some of the things that I'm talking about today would have been discussed in previous webinars. And so I might go over it quickly, only because the focus is slightly different, but it applies. Some of the things that we've talked about in previous webinars are going to apply to some of the work that we're talking about today. So, here we are. I imagine everyone here is a parent. I don't need to tell you that the nature of parenting under regular circumstances is challenging, right? Parenting usually involves everything from a lack of sleep, a sense of overwhelming responsibility. There's also noise, a mess, irritations, and daily challenges. Of course, we also experience a variety of moods and emotions, from joy to irritation, frustration, ambivalence, oh my God, what do I find myself in, and exhaustion. This is under normal circumstances. We can all relate to this. Now, when you're going through a divorce or separation, one of the things that's really important to recognize is, of course, this is an added stressor to what is already can be a stressful experience. One of the things that often comes up in the work that we do is just recognizing, and this came up when we did the webinar on mindful parenting. One of the things that's really important to recognize is that prolonged stress leads to a deterioration of our stress response, right? When we're in a state of prolonged tension and stress, we're going to find that the little things in life can lead to big emotional reactions. we're more likely to be irritable, angry, have outbursts. And so it's really important for us to recognize that it's already stressful to be a parent. Adding another prolonged stressor is going to make it that much harder. So a couple of things, and one of the difficult things about this talk is that I may be talking to people who are at different stages of going through a divorce or separation. Some people might be considering it, some might be going through it, it might have already occurred. One of the things that's important to recognize, and one of the challenges that are going to happen, and you will have experienced this, is where there's a transition that is occurring, right? Even in your own mind, there's a transition from moving from the romantic part or the relationship part with this person to the parenting part, where you're now seeing how you're going to have a relationship with another individual that is completely focused on the children or child. One of the things that's important to recognize that if you're going through this transition point, it is going to be like a sense of grief. And we can have a whole talk about grief, but one of the main things I want to emphasize, because it will also come up for the children, is that grief brings about a variety of reactions and emotional responses. And it's important to recognize that, as we know, all of us have gone through grief. It comes and it goes, and there is no right way to grieve, and there's no right way to respond to something like a separation and divorce. And so one of the things the reason I emphasize that is because it goes right into one of the components that we're going to be talking about is self-compassion and self-understanding, which is really crucial, particularly if you are predisposed to sort of have very negative self-talk about yourself. And so when we go through this separation or divorce, remember that we might be experiencing grief. And again, one day might feel great. We might be like, things are looking great, and a drop of a hat, you might find yourself quite emotional. And so be kind to yourself if that is occurring. Another thing that's actually also, important for us to talk about is that, again, if you're going through this stage, going through divorce or separation, that for some individuals, the decision to separate or to divorce can bring about its own negative experiences and connotations. It could bring about a sense of failure. I failed at this relationship. It could bring about disappointment, right? I'm so disappointed in myself. I'm disappointed that we weren't able to work it out. It could be like, did I give up? It could also bring about fear. What is happening next? Things like labels like single dad, single mom, single parent can take on a tone of isolation and exclusion. And your relationships with support networks change. If you and your partner if you had some connections or relationships through your partner and that has now been severed, that is also a significant change for you to adapt to. The reason I mention this, and this is very consistent with what we're going to talk about in terms of ACT, is one of the things that we try to do in ACT is to help individuals to recognize the train of thought that is running in the background that we don't always pay attention to, right? And so if I'm walking around and I'm thinking, that I'm a failure, of disappointment, that I'm now single dad or whatever it is, and it brings about its negative sort of connotations, that is going to actually interfere, perhaps, with the decisions I make as a parent, with the decisions I make as an individual. And so it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize that you may be having some of these responses, and again, we're going to practice self-compassion and self-understanding without judgment, which is crucial for us when we talk about mindful parenting. Now, of course, divorce or separation is quite a big decision for adults and a big change for adults. And it's that much bigger for the children who have to experience this. One of the things, again, very to mirror what I just said about you and perhaps experiencing emotions related to grief, is the same is going to happen with children, right? They are going to experience a full range of emotions when a family decides to separate or divorce. A few things that are going to be must-dos for you as parents. When you have a conversation with the kids, we're emphasizing that it's not their fault. We're emphasizing that the decision to sort of separate or divorce is independent of their relationship with their parents and the love that you have for them, and that you will continue to be available and present and involved in their lives. So while their world might be changing, we're establishing this idea that it's not their fault. We continue to love them and we will continue to be present and available. When you explain this to the child, be ready for anything. They are allowed to respond as they will. There is no right way, much like I said about grief, there is no right way for them to respond. Okay, reactions might come and go. One day they might seem fine, another day they might not be so doing fine anymore. One of the things that, I don't put this in the slides, but one of the things I want you to consider is something becomes clinically significant when it is prolonged. So if the child is having trouble sort of responding or adapting to a change, over a longer period, but more importantly, when it's starting to impair with functioning. So if it's getting in the way of attending school, of attending after school activities, if they're having prolonged emotional outbursts, a lot of negative self-talk, that's when we're starting to think about, is this now something that we need to sort of address? Not the initial sort of emotion, the range of emotions you might get when a decision is shared with a child. That is okay. We're going to navigate that. We're going to ride that wave. It is when it is prolonged and it is impairing that we start to ask whether we need some professional support. When the decision is made to, and you'll see this, I'm going to go into this a little bit more detail later on, but a couple other things that we want to think about when we're preparing our children for that transition towards, that separation or divorce is first thing is you want to make sure you make time for that discussion. Whenever you're going to sit down with the children, you're going to make sure there are no distractions, nothing else is important. That discussion and that time is going to be scheduled for you to process this with your child. One of the very first things, it doesn't matter the age of the child, you're going to want to do is provide reassurance. Because for a child, even if they've seen a lot of fighting or they've maybe had an inkling that things were going well in terms of the relationship, for many of them, it's going to be a complete shock. And the first thing the children are going to think about is now what? Which is going to bring a big response in terms related to anxiety and worry. And so we are going to try to provide reassurance for them in that moment. Once decisions are made, you're going to want to discuss new family structures with specifics. The more specific you are, the better you are at providing reassurance for your children. And of course, you're also going to give your child a voice. This goes back to what I just said about responding in any way they're going to respond. When they respond in a certain way, and again, we'll go through this in a little bit more detail later, we're going to acknowledge, listen to, and most importantly, validate your child's reactions. The validation is going to be crucial. And here, remember, when we talk about validation, we're talking about saying yes to any emotional reaction. Any emotional reaction, including anger, frustration, a sense of betrayal, all of those are valid for your child to have. There's no such thing as an emotional reaction that is wrong. And so whatever they respond with, we're going to validate that and say, I understand why you're feeling blank. Okay? Now, as we transition, into talking about some of the guidelines that I'm going to try to provide for you as you think about co-parenting, it's important to recognize that for some of us, we might think about like, how am I supposed to have a relationship with this other person who I no longer want to see or be around, right? What if there is hurt, pain, anger, disgust, a sense of betrayal? Just as I said that your child can experience any emotion, it's true of us as adults. We can have any of those emotional reactions to the thought of doing something with a partner or a co-parent. Those are valid. We're not going to question whether those are valid or not. One of the things I want to sort of establish, though, is that two things can coexist simultaneously, even if they seem like opposites, and one does not have to diminish the other. What I mean by that is, your sense of anger, frustration, hurt, sense of betrayal can exist, while at the same time, we can think about what does my child need as we transition into this new phase of life. Any decisions that I'm going to be talking about in terms of the parenting realm do not take away, do not require you to not feel what you feel in relation to your co-parent. You're allowed to feel what you're going to feel about your co-parent. And at the same time, I would encourage you, and we often talk about the word, using the word and. I can feel this about my co-parent, and I can think about the parenting that I have to do in response to my child's needs with that co-parent that I feel this for. So that's something that I really want you to think about. I know it can be very hard depending on where you're at and how you're feeling about the separation and divorce. This could be a very big ask that I'm asking you to do, and yet at the same time, I think in many ways it is what is going to increase the chances of getting to successful co-parenting. And I recognize that what I'm asking you is a big ask. And because I'm asking you for a big ask, and before I go into specifics about what are some guidelines for co-parenting, I want to sort of set a framework for you. And the framework, as I said at the beginning, is based on acceptance and commitment therapy. For short, you'll hear this called ACT, not ACT, it's called ACT. And ACT is an approach that helps us to accept what is out of our control, the separation, the divorce, perhaps whatever the co-parent did, and at the same time commit to action that improves or enriches our lives, and from the parenting standpoint, the lives of our children. So how do I accept that I am angry, I am hurt, I feel betrayed? I can accept those emotions without judgment, without any sort of self, hatred because I feel those things. And at the same time, how can I focus on committed action to be the best parent that I can be within this scenario? The goal of ACT is to foster what we call psychological flexibility, which is basically the opposite of rigidity and avoidance. When we experience an intense emotion like fear or anger, we tend to go into a pattern of action, right? If I'm angry, I'm looking to sort of release the anger in some way, maybe make someone pay. If I'm afraid for my future, and I might be really scared, and I might be looking for, okay, what am I going to do next, and try to always be out thinking what I'm worried about. In either of those scenarios, or any, actually even happy, you could be within a pattern or a path that is very rigid. Anything that we're stuck on can lead to rigidity. And when we're rigid, it actually makes our life less enriched and less valuable. And so in ACT, what we're trying to say is all of these paths can coexist, they're true. And what we want to do is build our ability to be mindful, present in the moment, accept the moment for what it is. This is a difficult experience that I'm going through, and I'm feeling anger and frustration and disgust. And at the same time, I'm going to focus on what I can do as a parent, because that's what my child needs, with the practice of self-acceptance. Okay, so this is why I love ACT, is because it allows you to acknowledge that some things have not gone well, and they can be present without us having to solve them, and we can still pivot towards meaningful action in our lives. I'll go into a little bit more detail. In ACT, if you were to go Google ACT, what you're going to find is there's 6 components that go into the ACT framework. We're going to be talking about 2 of them, and I talked about this in one of the earlier, I think the first webinar that I did for Prime Care. The 2 that we're going to be focusing on today are values and committed action. Okay, I'll go into those in a little bit. And again, in ACT, we're willing to face our thoughts and feelings and the challenges that life brings in the service of things we value. I'm willing to co-parent even though I feel disgust, anger, whatever it may be, because it is in the service of allowing my child to grow up to be resilient and successful. So let's talk about values. Values is a very interesting, and I spend actually therapeutically, I spend quite a bit of time going over values with my clients. Well, that's a really good question. There is nesting, you could, or cohabit. Yeah, we'll talk about that. So in terms of values, one of the things I want to point out, because sometimes people get stuck, values are different than goals. Okay, so a goal is an achievable outcome. A value is almost, we often use a compass point. In ACT, we tend to use a lot of analogies. In the last talk, I think I used the compass point, or I might have used the Oh my God, why am I forgetting? The light in the sea. What are you? A lighthouse. So in values, we often use analogies. So one of them is sort of a compass, or the other one is a lighthouse. The idea is that values are things that help to direct our behavior. They help us to move in a direction while acknowledging that we may never achieve the value. So, for example, the best way I can define this is my value might be to be a present dad, someone who's present and available. I will never be at enough events to earn a certificate that says you've achieved the present dad status. I will never achieve it. And yet every day I have the opportunity to choose something that moves me in the direction of that value of being a present dad. And so in values, I want you to think about it. They are qualities and characteristics you want to be about or that you aspire to. And they are direction points and not destinations. I say this to you, and the reason I like the lighthouse analogy is because sometimes you could be in the middle of the ocean in rough waters with huge waves, and you can feel lost and like you're drowning. And the lighthouse is what guides you in terms of like, oh, that path is safe, and this is where I should be moving. And I imagine that for some of you, you might be feeling like that at times. And the values is what I would suggest are what are going to guide your choices today and tomorrow. And so, I'll show you a list of values that, just to give you examples so that you can start thinking about it. But this is why I like ACT, because if I'm asking you to do this big thing and to consider something like co-parenting, given that there might be so much pain and hurt and anger, I think that values is going to be one of the ways that that is achievable. And then lastly, the last component is committed action. And committed action is basically a small step that you're taking towards that direction point. So if I'm going to go west, and I know that that's where I want to move in that direction, then I'm taking one step towards the west. And that's getting me a bit closer to that value. And so a lot of what, if you've seen my other talks, one of the things that I emphasize all the time is committed action could be a 1 degree change, right? It could be wherever you are today, 1 degree change might be changing how you respond to your co-parent text. It might be a way that you connect with your child when they express something like, "Oh, I love when mom did this, or when dad did this, or the co-parent did this," and you feel that sense of like, "Oh," and it might be just changing how you might respond to that. It might be 1 degree change towards being a whatever a value or type of parent that you want to be. Okay, so in other words, committed action is putting our values into practice. Part of the reason why I talk about ACT is because this is the framework for us to shift towards more mindful parenting. And I did do a webinar on mindful parenting, but in this context, when we're talking about mindful parenting, what I'm hoping to develop in parents is a sense of awareness. Awareness in this context means paying attention to why you're responding in specific ways, right? Without judgment again. I can feel irritation, I can feel anger, I can feel like my co-parent is asking too much of me. They have the audacity to do what? That is part of mindful parenting, is starting to become aware of reactions like that, starting to understand why we might feel that way. It's like, yeah, it makes sense that I would have that reaction because I'm angry and I feel like I have no closure, or it also helps to understand what you might see in a co-parent. Oh, I get why they're doing that because this and this. And then lastly, one of the other things I want you to think about as we move towards mindful parenting is how do we increase our awareness, increase our understanding so that we can communicate effectively under following our values, right? So communicating effectively so that I am getting the best outcome that I can for the children or child that we are co-parenting. And the focus is on providing comfort, predictability, and security for your children. And how do we do that? Well, imagine again, as we're going, as I mentioned earlier, this transition point is a big, scary transition for kids. For depending on their age, they might be responding very differently. Some of them may not be able to express how they're actually feeling. And for older kids, you might actually get it right in your face as to how they're feeling. And so while we're going through this transition point, we're trying to instill a sense of trust if it's been lost. We're trying to instill a sense of consistency. We're trying to remember to be attuned to the emotional and physical needs of our children. We're helping children to feel seen and understood. That is through validation and listening and acknowledging. And you're hoping to have cordial or at least non-adversarial sort of relationships with co-parents. In essence, we're trying to provide protection, love, support, and the freedom to be kids, even though there might be chaos in other aspects of their lives. One other thing that's really important, and I think you probably have heard of this, is sort of the reason we're talking about these things is because what we want our children to develop is secure attachment. Now, secure attachment is usually more closely related to, the first few years of life. But it is something that we can constantly be adapting to try to establish secure attachment. And secure attachment basically refers to the quality of the relationship between a parent and their child, whereby the child has a stable and secure basis for navigating life. I often talk about it as a safe haven, right? They can go out and explore the world and fall down and fail and have successes, and they can always return back to the safe haven that is a parent that is there for them to meet the needs. And that's because a child with this kind of secure base can weather the storms of adversity. You're in essence building resilience if your child has the capacity to come back, resettle, have their needs met by a parent. You're basically increasing their resilience to be able to experience life and whatever it is that is thrown their way. I should point out as we go into the next phase of the talk is going to be on what are some guidelines for co-parenting. I want to stipulate that I want to state that this does not apply if you or your child is in danger, right? If you're worried about what your co-parent might do in terms of safety and security, all this is out the window. At that point, you're just seeking support, whether it's legal, whether it's police, whether it's finding a shelter or a support network to guide you and your children. That's going to be priority over anything else I talk about the rest of the webinar. So co-parenting, what are we talking about with co-parenting? Well, co-parenting is basically when two parents jointly raise a child, even though they're separated, divorced, or not living together. And this can be made up of a lot of different sort of family, dynamic or makeup or living scenarios. But co-parenting is when they're jointly, two individuals are jointly raising a child. Why do we want to co-parent? Well, one of the things that we want to think about is as we increase our ability to co-parent successfully, we are increasing the chances that children are going to feel secure. They're going to benefit from consistency. They're going to understand, oh, look how my parents problem solve, and they're going to have a very healthy example to follow. And we're going to, as I mentioned last time, is we're going to be producing more resilient individuals. And very importantly, if we're able to successfully co-parent, what we're doing is we're allowing our children to learn through lived experience that they are more important than the conflict that ended your marriage or partnerships, or I should have changed the word marriage, or the relationship that led to prior to the divorce or separation. So what are the 6 C's of co-parenting that I'm going to be talking about? One is commitment, collaboration, clarity, consistency, connection, and community. So let's go through each one. Commitment refers to the decision to create some certainty within the midst of change. Here is what we're doing is as we go through separation or divorce, we're committing to be present and responsive to our child's need. And we're also, this is, so one thing I think is important to emphasize, and sometimes can be hard to do, we're also committing to making a firm decision. Sometimes in the families that we work with, we're seeing families that are going back and forth. And I understand relationships can be very sort of, they can be hot and cold in some scenarios. You want to sort of protect children from that hot and cold, the back and forth, right? And so when you're committing to either separate or divorce, you're trying to make a clean break. You're also trying to think about setting up a foundational understanding between both co-parents. And lastly, you want to tend to whatever commitment you're doing. If you're committing to, and you'll see in the next slide what I'm talking about, you're still tending to it, meaning like a garden, you're gonna every so often check up and make sure that things are going well and making tweaks as needed. So for example, when I talk about a foundational understanding, I'm thinking about asking each co-parent these type of questions. These are the things I want you to be thinking about as you look to transition into this next phase of potential co-parenting. Do you say yes to putting your child's needs first? Do you say yes to your child having two present, available, and loving parents? Do you say yes to sharing the responsibility of parenting? Do you say yes to never threaten the relationship between your child and the other parent? And there's a bunch of there's a whole litany of sort of questions that can sort of help you develop a foundational statement. In some ways, what we want to do is try to see if we can come to an agreement. Some of the things that even though we might feel all these strong emotions towards each other, these are some of the things that are going to be our values as parents as we head into this next phase. Second C is collaboration, working together to fill the shared vision of a resilient and successful child. As I read more and more research, references, I chuckled a few times because there's more than one reference that talks about thinking about this almost like a nonprofit with the same shared values, or thinking about this as a business transaction where you're, or like a business relationship where like, okay, what is our goal here? Our goal is to create the product, which is a successful, resilient, beautiful child who has learned to navigate life and what throws their way. In essence, that is what we want to focus on when we're thinking about the collaboration part of co-parenting. Here is where values become important. So this is important to me in terms of thinking about, like, as you're going to transition to these co-parenting relationship, to think about what are the values that you want to instill under your roof. And hopefully there are one or two that they're going to be consistent across both parents. So things like honesty, presence, independence, kindness, responsibility, compassion, authenticity, all these creativity, equality, flexibility. And this is only just a sample of values. If people are interested, they can email me later and I can give you a values worksheets. A couple of important things in the event that you're having trouble like grasping values. One of the things I did in the previous webinar, and I'm going to ask you to maybe just quickly go over right now, is a value is something like, imagine you overhear your child talk about you, and you can only hear positives. And they say things that make you feel warm about, like, oh my God, they noticed that, or I did a good job as a parent because they said this about me. What would you want them to say about you? Right? Like, would you want them to say, again, I'll use me as an example with my two boys. If I could overhear my boys talking to their friends, I would love for them to say, yeah, he's funny and he's always present and he's available. And when we come to him, he puts everything down and makes us a priority. Right? Those are reflective of my values as a dad. If they can recognize those things, that's really important to me as a parent. So this is, thinking about values is going to guide that ability to think about collaboration with a co-parent. The third C is clarity. And with clarity, I think we all know that oftentimes communication, particularly to adults who have some, sort of negative valence in their relationship, excuse me, will have trouble with communication. And so as we transition to co-parenting, we really want to think about clear, concise, calm, and timely communication. And in essence, what we're trying to do is to avoid misunderstandings, but also, more importantly, is to provide accountability. If we say we're going to do something, we're going to actually commit to that. One of the things I want to emphasize here, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on, is we're aiming for good enough communication. Right? Good enough communication is bare essentials without venting and adding your emotional reactions. It's pragmatic. It involves little things like changes to schedule, something going on with the child. Hey, there's a meeting at the school. Teacher said this. They're concerned about this. Finances, home maintenance. It is good enough communication to get the job done. Okay, so this is, I think that the reason I stop a little bit to emphasize this is because good enough communication might be something that is hard for people who have really high expectations for themselves, right? And so if we're working in the spirit of being mindful parents who engage in self-acceptance and self-compassion, good enough parenting is going to be good enough. A few guides to clarity. We're going to try to consider being considerate and respectful. We're going to be brief and concise. I'm going to give you some other examples later on. We're going to provide relevant information. Whatever the co-parent needs to know, we're going to offer that to them. And the reverse, if we don't understand something, we're going to not be afraid to ask questions to seek clarification. And then lastly, and I think this is a huge one, is we're going to acknowledge when a message is received. Sometimes, that is something that we forget to do, and it can be something that can mitigate fights or arguments. The next C is consistency. And this is where we're focusing on creating and establish consistent structure and expectations for the child across settings. In essence, what we're trying to do is provide a sense of reliability and predictability in our child. And a few sort of things to consider here is, realistically, if a child has two homes to live across, you're not going to be consistent across the board. So part of being, again, a mindful parent who accepts things that they might otherwise see as a failure, we're going to accept that not everything is going to be consistent. One of the things I would ask you if we're going to transition to co-parenting is try to establish 2 or 3 non-negotiables across homes. And on those 2 or 3 things, we're going to present a united front so that we can keep our messaging consistent. Examples of that would be something like, if you're working with teens, or if you have teens, it might be things like truancy. What are the consequences to missing school? What are the consequences to substance? What are the consequences to missing curfew? Those are the 3 things that you might have that might be non-negotiables that would be consistent across environments and where you want to present a united front. For a 6-year-old, it might be, what do we do when they hit their sibling? What do we do when they throw their food at the parent? Whatever it might be, we might have 2 or 3 non-negotiables that would be consistent across households. One of the things that we're going to want to think about when we think of consistency is we want to avoid things like getting into a tug of war with the child in the middle. So an example of this is going up to the child and say, hey, would you prefer to do this with me or this with your parent, your other? You don't want to put your child into that scenario. And lastly, and this is a crucial one, is we don't want to throw each other under the bus, even though you might feel like they warrant it. Feeling like they warrant it is different than, does my child, when I'm thinking about my parenting and what they require, do they need to know that my co-parent needs to be thrown under the bus or warrants it? I would argue that most of the time that is a big no. The next C is connection. And this is one of my favorite ones. This is really consistent with some of the parenting or the talks that I did earlier, is when the child is with me, I am going to be present and mindful. In essence, what I'm going to be focusing on is being attuned with my child's needs, because that is the basis for secure attachment. And the way we do that is a few things. One is make your time count. When your child is with you, prioritize that time, right? Work on other things when they're not with you so that when they're with you, you do have time to spend quality time under best case scenarios I'm talking about here. Of course, if you have work requirements and it's very hard for you, then we try to find moments where that connection counts. And it might be a minute or 2. I'll give you a very quick example. I talk about this in every webinar I do, but I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. And this goes to the second point. Try to create new routines through small little changes that we repeat so that they create meaning. So an example, and I provide this in previously, is imagine that I'm feeling I'm disconnected from my son. I might come in on one day and for a minute, I might ask him about his day. Like, hey buddy, how was your day? And I spend 1 minute asking him. Nothing else exists during that moment. Everything is put away. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not thinking about what's for dinner. I'm not thinking about taking him to soccer. In that moment, everything that he's telling me is the most important thing in the world. And I do that for 1 day, and I repeat it for a second, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth day. What I've done is I've taken 1 minute, small little change with repetition has created meaning. So now all of a sudden my child can tell others that, or if they ever ask, they tell me about your dad, they will maybe recount how I connect with him on a frequent basis and whenever I can, even if it's for a brief moment. And I say that to you because 2 good examples of that would be to perhaps develop things like a goodbye ritual. So when they're moving towards, or when they're going to the co-parent's house, is what is a little thing that you can make your own? that you can make for you and your child that is going to be meaningful every time you say goodbye, and vice versa when they come back to you. How do we make that that sort of experience meaningful and an opportunity to connect? And this is why I say to you, 1 degree change. It could be a tiny little thing that you start to do today or tomorrow, and you repeat, and all of a sudden, a year from now, it's gonna be like, yeah, dad or mom does always does this, and all of a sudden, you have something that's meaningful, and that basically signifies to your child that you're connected and that they're the most important thing in the world in that moment. And lastly, the last C is about community. And one thing that I think is important to recognize is as we go through this transition point is how do you as a parent think about connecting with the community and building a support system? Because the support system, as I said earlier, might be different than the support system that you had while you were still in the relationship. And in essence, what we're trying to do is we're giving a sense of belonging and stability, not only for ourselves, but our children. And we're also doing things like modeling, help seeking, and the importance of connection. And one of the things here that I'd like for you to think about is you may want to think about relationships that help to maintain and foster healthy connections that might be at risk through a separation or divorce, and thinking about, do we want to maintain certain relationships that are really important to the child, even though that relationship had ended? Now, what I just said to you is best case scenario. It's almost like if I was if I had shares in co-parenting, those are the steps that I would be asking you to buy into. Like buy into that. These are the 6 things that I want you to think about as you move towards co-parenting. The reality is that you might have somebody whose back is turned. You might not have a willing partner. So if you do not have a willing partner, or you have a partner that is maybe even volatile or unpredictable, then we're going to look at a slightly different way of approaching divorce or separation. If you have an adversarial relationship, I don't think I need to tell you guys this, but document everything in detail, right? You're going to be documenting everything that occurs. You're going to focus on what you can control. We're not going to try to change the co-parent and try to get them to see that they're wrong or in the wrong. We're going to focus on what we can control. We're going to engage in self-care, including therapy and seeking legal advice. Oops. And we're going to connect, like I said last time, we're going to connect with a support network. In addition, if you have a co-parent that doesn't sort of buy into any of the 6 C's that I talked about, we want to keep some things in mind as the one parent who wants to have positive co-parenting relations. We don't want to use our child as a messenger. We don't want to ask them to communicate on your behalf, and we want to refrain from asking them to spy or to report back on what the co-parent is doing, even though this part of me might feel like it is warranted for me to know what the other co-parent is doing. I can have those feelings and they can be valid. And at the same time, I can refrain from asking them to spy or to report back, because I recognize that asking them to do this is not conducive to the type of parent I want to be to the child. A couple other things. If you have a co-parent that is perhaps not engaging and again, it's adversarial, you can be doing things like modeling barriers and putting barriers in place, right? So changing all communication to email, setting times and limits as to when you're going to respond to things, being able to be assertive if they talk to you rudely or aggressively, trying to be assertive so that you can model this for any child that's observing or watching, that you are worthy of not being spoken to in a specific way, but also being able to be assertive to communicate your needs in an appropriate way. And also the reason you want to communicate via email are things like it puts everything in writing, but it also, more importantly, allows us to pause, edit, and think before pressing send. One of the best things, and my sister tells me, so my sister is the other co-director at the clinic. She's always telling me, make sure you send it tomorrow morning. Like if there's an email, something's angering me or something, she says, send it tomorrow morning. And it's always like, that's such a good idea. So now I schedule send emails, So if you're going to respond to your co-parent and you're not sure if it's the right tone, do a scheduled send for next morning at 10 a.m. or something, and you have time the next morning to review it before it goes out. The other thing I want you to think about is if you have a co-parent who's not sort of participating in this idea of co-parenting, I want you to think about how you can set limits on things when the child is with you, right? setting limits on when they talk to the co-parent, like things like not past a certain time because it's their bedtime, making sure that they have homework done before they talk to the co-parent, only because you want to establish routines, and you want to make sure that those are consistent with the values that you have under your roof. So for example, if education is a value for you, then you're going to want to make sure that is being sort of maintained, even though the other co-parent is asking for something. One of the things, if you're finding yourself really struggling with a parent who is not engaging in healthy relations, I want you to maybe pivot a little bit and think about how you are going to be the responsible, consistent figure in your child's life. You're going to be the one that's going to try to have open-ended conversations with your child and allow them to feel and express anything they want. You're going to be the one that validates and coaches and guides. And we're going to go to the next slide. We'll walk you through some of these steps. You're going to be the one who, especially if you have a child whose parent is very critical or very demanding, you'll see this sometimes when another parent has high expectations for like rep hockey or grades. And if you see that your child is starting to maybe define themselves through the struggles or the challenges that they have in what the other parent is emphasizing, this is where we have the capacity to expand the self-worth of the child, right? To be able to emphasize other things that are important, or that there are other aspects of their lives that we can look at as what we want to focus on. In essence, if you don't have a co-parent that's willing to engage in good faith, your mission is to ensure that your child understands what unconditional love is, right? That's the one thing you can control, is how I can show unconditional love to my child in the service of my values. So going back to the validation piece, and this is something, again, if you want to see more in more detail, this is in some of the webinars that are again available through Prime Care, but also available on the EPS Family Health YouTube channel. Is when we're validating, in essence, we're following three steps. We're attending to the emotion, we're tuning in to turning into the emotion, versus what we typically want to do is tune out, especially of emotion that we find difficult, like anger. We want to sort of give maybe reprimand if we see anger. I'm asking you to attend, label for your child. If your child is young, you're going to be doing all of this like quite specific. I can see you're angry because you're turning red, and you yelled at mommy or you yelled at daddy. And I can understand the validation is I can understand why you feel that way, because you're being asked to go from one house and the other, and you forgot your teddy at the other house, and I can understand why that's really difficult, and supporting the need. Oh, yeah. Are you sad because you're missing do you want a hug from dad? Okay, and hug. And so in essence, that's what you can control. You can't control the other environment. And so we're going to focus on that connection and that relationship with our child in the moment by attending to the emotion, labeling, and validating. One of the things that I've talked about in the past is, if you find yourself in an exchange with your child and you don't know what to do, don't try to answer it for them. Don't give them an out. What I mean by that is sit with whatever strong emotion they are expressing and sharing with you, and just say something like, "Wow, that sounds so hard. I'm so sorry you're going through that. Can I hug? Do you want a hug? I am not providing answers and solutions. I am sitting with them. It's in one human being with another saying, oh my God, I can't believe you're going through this. How can I support you?" In essence, what we're doing is we're rolling out the red carpet for difficult emotions and scenarios when they get older. Couple other things, I'm looking at the time, so a couple other things we want to consider, just some logistics. If you're thinking about like how are we going to split time with parent, in terms of where the child is going to spend some time, of course we're going to have to consider things like a parent schedule, a child schedule. Ideally, what you want to think about is minimizing disruption while maximizing the time with each of you, right? You also want to think about the needs of the child, if there's special needs, if there's special access to resources that one home would give over the other. You want to think about the capacity of the parent to be able to support the emotional needs of a child. And there's also going to be a time to speak about child's preference, particularly if a child is older. And so those are some things we're going to want to consider when thinking about how we're going to split up time. One of the resources I give you at the end is about developing a parenting plan. right? And this is where, if you're going to hopefully be working with a parent who's willing to work on co-parenting, this is where you start to hash out some of the details, right? When the child spends times with each parent, child are made, how information is shared and communicated between parents, how other parenting is addressed, and how future disagreements about the children are to be resolved. This, in the best case scenario, is going to be following what I said earlier, is this can occur even though you feel pain, anger, betrayed, right? I know I keep emphasizing that, but I want to emphasize that I am not asking you to forgive and forget. I'm asking you to do this in while those other emotions are existing. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of concrete strategies, and these are taken from previous talks, and these are both something that we use in ACT. The first one is dropping anchor. If you were to Google, if you want to spend some time, if you want to Google like Russ Harris, Russ Russ Harris, if you were to Google him, and he has a lot of YouTube channel videos, and one of my favorite things he does is dropping anchor. And dropping anchor is basically a strategy that we use with individuals of all ages, whether it's children or adults, and it's basically trying to create stability. So dropping an anchor, even though there might be a storm at the top of the ocean. The dropping anchor does nothing to get rid of the storm, but it creates stability. And the way you do it is usually you take some breaths, you notice what you're thinking, you notice what you're feeling in your body, you connect with your body. So things like or pressing your hands together and then using your senses to be present, it will help you to make a decision that is value-based afterwards. It doesn't do away with the anger and the red that you were seeing because of what your co-parent did. It allows you to say, now that I've grounded myself, how do I want to respond in a way that is appropriate and consistent with my values as a parent? And the last one is the concept of flavoring and savoring. Very quickly, I'll go through this. If let's say I'm creating a dish, I always use this analogy, and I love pepper. It's me sprinkling the pepper when I'm making the dish, and later on when I'm eating it, I'm going to savor that flavor of the pepper because I love it and because I purposely put it in there. The same is true when we're thinking about connecting with our children. Making those moments count is think about what are little things you can sprinkle into your days when you have the children with you, and how do you make those important and meaningful, and when they occur, sit back and savor it because you are the one that sprinkled it into the day. Oh, sorry, I went backwards. Some final thoughts. And this is why I chuckled a couple times. There are quite a few references talked about this. Thinking about as we shift to co-parenting is almost thinking about a workplace relationship. Thinking about, you're not going to like everyone that you work with. How would you respond if it was a workplace with if somebody who treated you in a certain way? You're going to look for a mutual goal. Remember, here we are working towards creating a child or children who are successful and resilient. Maybe we can develop empathy for the co-parent as this hopefully, cultivate respect if possible. We're going to pick our fights. This is what's under our control. For compromise, not always. I don't like the always. Sometimes look for compromise are best of times. And we're going to remember that all things interact. This last point is this. If you think about something like if your child is having significant anxiety and distress, or they're having trouble concentrating, we might focus on getting them a good night's sleep, because a good night's sleep is going to give them more resources to get through their day. And so while we're not targeting directly the concentration, we know that by giving them good night's sleep, it connects with everything else. The same is true in these scenarios. If you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, small thing in the environment that you can do, and remember that if you change something in this, it's going to interact with other parts that may feel like they're out of your control. And that's why I put that last statement. Here are some references. I'm going to share the slides. I'm going to share the slides, by the way. I'm going to put the talk up on our website. on our YouTube channel. Just a couple of things I want to point out. This is an example of a parenting guide. This is the Toronto resource, Families and Transitions. I tried to find one in Halton, and I had a bit more trouble. I've added the Imagination Press here. This is the American Psychological Association. It's actually a great website that will give you books by topic. So if you want to find a book for help my child with anxiety, you can go to Imagination Press, look by topic, and they'll give you a list of books. Anger, sexuality. You'll find books on this website. This is for any men who are going through transitions and might have experienced abuse. This is Rock in Halton. And lastly, if you want to find psychologists who are going to help you with the custody and access, the best place is to go to the CPA or the OPA website and try to find a psychologist with that specialization, or reach out to them and ask them if they know anybody who does that type of work. If you want me to look into that for you, you could always email me, and I will do my best to try to find somebody. And here's my email address before I open up for questions. Sorry. This is my email address, Dr. E. Roldan at Topical Psych. And this is our Instagram sort of, and EPS Family Health is the YouTube channel. Okay, thank you. I'm going to look and see if there's any questions.
There was an earlier question, Dr. Ed. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. There is no real prolonged. I would say, I don't know if I have an answer for you prolonged. It might be something, I might use something like maybe 6 months, maybe, depending on where the child is and how disruptive it is. If it is completely disruptive and you are having to change scenarios or change routines, or you're having to you can no longer go to family functions or restaurants, or they're not going to school at all, you're not waiting 6 months. You might wait, a month or two to see if it's sort of gets better. And if not, you might be at least consulting with a professional who's going to be able to guide you with that. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the to cohabitate is an interesting question. What I would say to you in my experience is that when I've seen that done, it has been really hard for parents to actually let go of some of the very intense emotions that are brimming on the surface. And so I would say to you, I think that would be workable if you're both willing to do some of those questions that I asked you about. Are we willing to accept that we might be feeling this anger, frustration, and at the same time, are we going to agree that when we're around the children and around each other, that we're emphasizing these things about our relationship with our children, and putting our relationship on sort of not making that the front and center? Then I could see that being a potential positive. In my experience, I've seen families struggle with that. Again, because there's so much emotion in the intention that parents think they're hiding, and kids are great at reading, right? And one thing, the reason, if you look at one of the C's is about clarity, clarity is also in how we communicate with our children, because when we leave things vague, our child's imaginations are going to be, very powerful in coming up with things that are maybe even way worse than whatever the reality is. Any other questions? I see somebody's typing, so I'm going to pause a little bit. Yeah, it's another webinar. You know what? Maybe I'll send, maybe before I send the presentation, I'll send a couple of books that might tap into that, in terms of how do you parent when another present is absent. I guess I would say to you, in terms of, do we need to have a concrete plan for who is living where before telling children about separation? That if I think that when you're going to tell your children about the separation, just know that that's going to be a question. So if we do not have concrete answers, then again, it's going to be quite stressful for children. the older they are, the maybe the more you can do that. In some ways, I think it's in a best case scenario. And again, I say this best case scenario, recognizing that it may not always be possible. In a best case scenario, you want to have some of those answers, those questions answered, so that you can present that information in a very succinct way. One of the things I didn't put in the slide is remember that we're being factual, but with not too, like, we don't have to give them additional information. We're giving them in just enough information for them to understand with as much honesty as we can without having to tell them things in terms of this is where we have to be careful about like using language like your mom did this or your dad did this or they did, that's the part that we want to pay attention to, even though it might be valid. We really want to pay attention to that when we're communicating with our children. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone coming on a Tuesday night. Again, you can go to EPS Family Health. This will be uploaded probably in the next week or so. You can go, I will probably share the slides with Prime Care. And if you email me, Dr. E. Roldan at Topical Psych, I would be more than happy to send you the slides or a PDF of the slides as well. I have again, don't be afraid to reach out to me if you have any questions, supports, even if you want me to look for services in your area. If you're not in either Etobicoke or Woodbridge, I could always maybe play a role in connecting you with services as well. Thank you all. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a good night, and thank you.